So good afternoon, everyone, and heartily welcome to this session on the global reproductive governance challenges and opportunities, where we have with us Professor Lynn Morgan. Before we start, please note that the session is being streamed on YouTube, and also it's going to be recorded. So if you don't want your name to appear anywhere, please make sure that you remove it. So that was just my short little warning. And then I would like to say a few words about Professor Lynn Morgan before I give the floor to her. So Lynn Morgan is a Professor Emerita at the Mount Holyoke University, Massachusetts, USA. And she's both a medical anthropologist and a feminist science studies scholar. And her research areas comprises medical anthropology, the anthropology of gender and sexualities. And in her research, she has had a main focus on the region, Latin American region. And based on her comprehensive studies and vast knowledge of the field of reproductive health and rights in Latin America and Central America, she has contributed to important theorizing within the field of medical anthropology. And among others, she has, together with a colleague, Elizabeth Morgan, coined the concept of reproductive governance, which you will learn more about today. So Lynn, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. And we look very, very much forward to your talk. And to the audience, Lynn will talk for some 40 minutes, and thereafter you will be able to engage in a discussion with her over the themes emerging from her lectures and other themes of your heart. But please post your questions in the chat and we will try to manage them as best as we can. Thank you. And Lynn, I give the digital floor to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk with all of you. You have to turn on the sound.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
I do have my sound on.
We still can't hear you. Let us just a second. Okay, so the other people can hear, but it's only we who cannot hear in this. Still can't hear you. Just a second. It's okay. It's okay. Okay, so the other people can hear. Yes. It's only we who cannot hear in this. It's okay.
So I should continue?
It's okay.
Okay. Okay, I'm glad we got that resolved. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and to talk with all of you from all the different summer courses at the University of Bergen about these ideas. I have tried to make my presentation very general, which means that I'm going to be a little bit out of my depth on some of these issues. And I'm sure some of you have thought about some of the issues that I'm going to talk about at least as much as I have. So I very much look forward to your questions and your comments and your reflections on what it is that I have to share today. So what I'd like to do at this point is share my screen and talk through some of these slides before opening it up to discussion. So if you'll give me just 1 second while I do that. So I assume you can now share, you can see my screen. And I will be talking about global reproductive governance, which is an idea that Liz Roberts and I came up with as we were thinking about how to understand some of the international, transnational, sort of global dimensions of reproductive health and rights in Latin America. And one of the ideas that I'd like to pose to you today, and one of the sort of messages that I'd like you to keep in mind, is that the solutions to the problems that we're interested in often depend on how we define those problems. This may seem to be kind of obvious, but it isn't always. And I will argue here that some of the ways that some of the issues have been defined isn't quite comprehensive enough to allow us to get at some of the dynamics of what's going on underneath. So let me start with this sort of paradox. The Sustainable Development Goals don't mention fertility or world population growth. And so here's a quote from an article from 2016 that says, fertility decisions are considered a private matter, with the role of the state being only to assure reproductive rights and to provide reproductive health services. It's presumably for this reason that the new Sustainable Development Goals do not mention population growth or fertility explicitly in any of the 169 targets. So you notice I highlighted here that fertility decisions are considered a private matter. And I want to come back to that in a second. Now, even though the Sustainable Development Goals don't mention fertility rates or world population growth, it's clear that they will have an impact on fertility and world population growth. So here's another quote from a very much cited study that came out a few years ago. Continued trends in female educational attainment and access to contraception will hasten declines in fertility and slow population growth. A sustained total fertility rate lower than the replacement level in many countries, including China and India, would have economic, social, environmental, and geopolitical consequences. Policy options to adapt to continued low fertility while sustaining and enhancing female reproductive health will be crucial in the years to come. So here we have two different approaches to this. And what it comes down to is that the Sustainable Development Goals will affect fertility and population growth, but do not address fertility and population growth. So how can we reconcile this? How can we reconcile the Sustainable Development Goals' failure to mention fertility rates and world population growth with the knowledge that meeting the Sustainable Development Goals would lower world population growth and result in economic, social, environmental, and geopolitical consequences? How could the Sustainable Development Goals not mention these things? So I want to give you my argument right here at the beginning. I think that this paradox, this apparent paradox, makes sense when it's viewed through the lens of global reproductive governance. And here's the argument. The argument is that framing fertility decisions as private and leaving them out of the Sustainable Development Goals was a deliberate decision. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't just that they were considered private and so they were left in the private realm. It's that the topic itself became too controversial to include in the Sustainable Development Goals. And it became controversial on in a couple of different realms. One, it became controversial because there were conservative civil society organizations that, for a variety of different reasons, including religious ideologies, opposed an emphasis on reproductive health and rights. But they also became controversial because the demographers and people who were interested in population dynamics were not in agreement with the activists who were interested in sexual and reproductive health and rights. And working out the disagreements between them became too problematic. And so fertility was just left out of the Sustainable Development Goals. The resulting gap, I think, allowed for a resurgence of population politics, pitting old fears of overpopulation against a new moral panic about depopulation. So you will all be familiar with the rhetoric about overpopulation and the growth of the world's population becoming a problem because it puts a strain on so many resources. And then you will also be aware, and I'll talk in a few minutes, about a new concern about depopulation in the world and declining fertility. So the third part of my argument is that politicizing fertility decline tempts governments to exercise population control and also to increase surveillance over bodies, potentially reproductive bodies, and to adopt pro-natalist policies. And finally, I want us always to remember that population control continues to be antithetical to reproductive health. So feminist scholars have long argued that reproductive labor is not private at all. Even though it is said to be private, reproductive labor is necessary to the reproduction of human life. Social reproduction, the schooling of children, the having of children, the raising of children, the caring for children and families and the elderly, the nursing that goes into social reproduction is a vital component of political and economic systems everywhere. This is an argument that's long been made in the literature. And yet relegating reproduction to the private realm ignores the processes that render it invisible, often unpaid, and unmentionable in the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I want to underscore this point. When we say that it's private, we ignore the processes through which it gets rendered as private, through which it gets rendered as invisible, through which it gets rendered as unmentionable and really unimportant. And I think that's a problem. We need to pay attention to those processes. So the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals coincided in many parts of the world with the election of populist leaders from the left and even more importantly from the right. And many of these populist leaders began to distance themselves from the Sustainable Development Goals. They opposed, in many cases, sexual and reproductive rights as part of their larger processes of dismantling liberal democratic institutions. Many of them, like in my country, created alliances between conservative religious activists and those in government, giving conservative religious activists greater access to the halls of power than ever before. They also have fomented moral panics around the specters of what got called gender ideology, abortion, and LGBT rights. For example, the Trump administration built an alliance, an international coalition of like-minded governments to denounce sexual and reproductive rights at the United Nations. And so there were these governments that were really opposing sexual and reproductive rights and opposing many of the Sustainable Development Goals in general, and trying to come up with a global coalition of other governments that would do the same. What this allowed, I think, was a resurgence of a kind of alarmist population politics that we're seeing very much in the news these days. The claim is that declining fertility rates are a disaster for nation states, including South Korea, Italy, Japan, the United States, Brazil, Norway, China, and many, many others. So I pulled just a couple of headlines from the news to illustrate to you how this is being portrayed in the media. One headline said, "How declining fertility rates may deliver us into oblivion." Another said, "Experts sound the alarm on declining birth rates among younger generations. It's a crisis." Another said, "Jaw-dropping global crash in children being born." And you see that one of the graphs that illustrated one of these articles pointed to women having fewer children. And what I want to point out here is that when the argument gets framed in these terms, in such alarmist terms, it really directs attention to women and their childbearing choices as the main problem. It blames women for not having enough children. So if we take a step back here and look at world population trends, we can see that the population of the world has actually almost tripled from 1956 when I was born. And yes, that's a picture of me when I was a little baby. And in 2020, now the population of the world is 7.8 billion. It's expected to peak in 2064 at 9.7 billion. And by 2100, it's expected to start falling again to 8.8 billion. So that is still quite a dramatic increase in the world's population in a very short period of time. The causes of rapid world fertility decline are many, and they're much debated in the literature. Part of it has to do with lower infant and child mortality rates, which you can see in this graph right here, which lead families to have fewer children because they can expect that more of their children will survive to adulthood. We also have higher levels of female education, of course, and female labor force participation, which have caused women to choose to have fewer children. We have access to reliable contraception, which was certainly not true in my grandmother's day. And we have lower marriage rates, fewer people deciding to get married at all in many countries, especially among well-educated people. And we have a higher marriage age. So the increasing age at marriage has gone up in many different countries. And you can see Norway here right below Sweden up at the top, where the average age of women at marriage is in the 30s, as compared to someplace like Bangladesh or Niger, where it may be closer to 17 or 18 years old. All of these things have contributed to dramatic fertility declines in the world. In many ways, this can be considered a success story, right? It's a good thing that the world population is starting to decline. That's what people were working on for a good part of the second half of the 20th century, was trying to convince people around the world to have fewer children. And in fact, that has happened. It's happened much more quickly than anyone thought possible. And the falling fertility rates are in many ways a success. They facilitate gender equality. They facilitate women's participation in the paid labor force. They reduce environmental degradation and food insecurity. They alleviate climate change, or can alleviate climate change. They can ease migration pressures, carbon emissions, the consumption of finite resources, and a number of other things. So in many ways, this is a success story. But governments are increasingly worried about falling fertility rates. They're concerned about the age structure of the population, where the number of children, small children, children under 5, for example, will fall from 681 million in 2017 to 401 million in 2100. And the number of over 80-year-olds will soar from 141 million in 2017 to 866 million in 2100. So they're concerned about the age structure of the population and about the fact that lower fertility, of course, amounts to an aging population. So you hear discussion about fears of a demographic winter. You hear concerns about who's going to work, who's going to pay taxes, who's going to care for the large population of elderly, who's going to serve in military and police forces to protect the population, how are retirement and healthcare going to be financed, and how will economic growth be sustained. So when you look at these questions, you can see a number of fundamental issues that governments are going to have to deal with, because they have structured a society that's dependent on having a large and growing population. And they've also structured a society where economic growth is built into their assumptions about how they're going to sustain themselves and have a good quality of life over time. So governments have proposed a number of different solutions, many of which have to do with encouraging childbearing. And this is really interesting and potentially problematic because, again, it focuses attention on women's reproductive choices and their decisions about having children. So one of the ways that governments propose to encourage childbearing is through enhanced parental leave policies, providing child bonuses to families who have more than X number of children, 3 children or 4 children, providing subsidies for childcare, and other kinds of financial incentives. And what this basically amounts to is a pronatalist policy on the part of governments, which is very much in contrast to a reproductive rights policy, which leaves it up to individuals to make their own reproductive decisions about whether, when, and under what circumstances they might want to have children, and if so, how many children they might want to have. Governments propose allowing increased migration to deal with fertility decline and population decline. If they bring in more migrants, then they can build up the number of workers that they have in the population. And sometimes migrant populations have higher fertility rates than some of the native-born populations, and that they think can be a problem. But analysts point out that when population is declining everywhere in the world, this is only a short-term solution. It's not going to work for a long period of time. And finally, I put a question mark here, but one of the things that governments may do is to restrict women's access to things like education, employment, and contraception and abortion. And when they do that, they are often stratifying reproduction. In other words, they're encouraging some groups of people to reproduce and discouraging other groups of people from reproducing. So what they're trying to do is to adjust or engineer the quality of the population, depending on what kinds of citizens, what kinds of subjects they want to have in the base of the population. And we see some of this with the recent announcement just a week or two ago that China is changing its policy now to allow families to have 3 children, which replaces 2 children, which of course replaces the infamous one-child policy that was in place for such a long period of time. And China has made the decision to do this because they are one of the governments that's very concerned about population decline and about fertility decline. This announcement on the part of the Chinese government was met with widespread skepticism. A lot of people seem to believe that the policy won't work. It won't have the intended effect. And that's in part because the 2-child policy didn't have the kind of intended effect either. Families have decided that children are too expensive to raise. And unless that changes, they don't see any good reason to have 3 children or to have more children. The announcement also led to charges of discrimination against women, and many people pointed out that the Chinese government does not allow unmarried mothers to take advantage of some of the benefits that it offers to married women, and that also certain segments of the population, such as ethnic minorities, are discouraged from having children at all. And this would be an example of the stratified reproduction that I talked about a minute ago, where some people are encouraged to have children and other people are not. And then furthermore, there's been an allegation by writers in the New York Times recently that what's really going on here is that the Chinese government doesn't want to give up its control over population and population policy and how many children people have. So they allege that population control remains the foundation of any surveillance state. And so that's, again, something to be concerned about, because I think what we're seeing here is a resurgence in interest in population control, which many of you will remember was widely criticized a number of decades ago for its coercive policies, coercing people to undergo sterilization and so forth against their will. So there's a concern about population control and about population control becoming the tool that governments resort to instead of adopting or embracing reproductive rights and reproductive health. So of course, some of you may be thinking, well, overpopulation and fertility decline aren't the only ways to frame the problem. And you're absolutely right about that. There are many people who've said we shouldn't be focusing on population at all, that what we should be looking at is an overconsumption of finite resources. In other words, if we all lived within our means, within the Earth's means, then we might not have a problem with overpopulation. The problem is really overconsumption. Another way of looking at the problem is that some people are consuming much more of the Earth's resources than others. So there's an unequal national and global distribution of wealth, of food, of forests, of water, of access to work, of education and medical care, and a number of other finite resources, including mineral resources and fossil fuels. We could look at the intensification of greenhouse gas emissions. And we all know this because of our emphasis on what's happened with climate change policy and attempts to try and control greenhouse gases. The world temperatures are still increasing at an unsustainable rate. There's been some discussion about a possible rise in infertility due to environmental factors. This is still debated, and I don't think that the scientists have come to an agreement about this, but there may be a rise in infertility. And if that's going on, then that might be one of the things to address in addition to thinking about overpopulation or fertility decline in its own terms. And then also young people are shifting their reproductive and sexual practices. As I've said, they're not getting married as early or as often as happened in the past. And they may be making decisions on their own about how many children they want to have, which again may be in part a response to their perceptions of what's happening in the world, and a decision not to want to contribute to overpopulation or to population growth. So there are many ways to frame the question. We can frame it in terms of overpopulation. We can frame it in terms of overconsumption. We can frame it in terms of inequitable consumption of the world's resources. There's a gender studies scholar named Jade Sasser who has a book out on this topic, and she reports that the richest 1% of people on the earth are responsible for more than double the amount of greenhouse gas emissions as the poorest 50% of people on the earth. So it's not just necessarily that there are too many people, it's that a small number of people are consuming a vastly inordinate amount of the world's resources. And maybe that's the problem that needs to be addressed rather than the problem of fertility decline per se. So when we frame things in terms of fertility decline, what we're often doing is we're directing attention to women's reproductive decisions. This is problematic from a reproductive and sexual rights perspective because it casts women as objects of state intervention rather than as subjects who are participating in decisions and discussions within the state about how to move forward and address some of the larger social challenges that are going to emerge with population declines over time. If we direct attention to fertility decline, then we cast reproductive bodies, sexuality, and reproduction as vital to the state. And we encourage surveillance of women's decisions in particular about marriage, age of marriage, about education, about work, about whether to freeze eggs or not, about childbearing, et cetera. In other words, we put the attention very much on women and women's decision makings, and we make women into objects of state surveillance. So when the problem is framed as fertility decline and relegated to the private sphere, then I would argue that it facilitates an emphasis on population control and pronatalism, including state surveillance of sexual and reproductive bodies. If, however, we frame the problem as a deliberate sidelining of sexual and reproductive rights perspectives in sustainable development conversations, then we can draw attention to conservative regimes and forces that oppose longstanding international commitments to sexual and reproductive rights. That puts the problem in a different kind of focus. And I would argue that that's one of the things that's really been left out of the conversation until this point, is that we're not really seeing or allowing ourselves to understand the contribution, the obstruction that conservative forces are sometimes putting into effect when they get involved in discussions about the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to be paying attention to that. We need to be paying attention to where the sources of obstruction are, what impact they're having on policymaking and decision making, and we need to confront that as part of the conversation that we're having about how to move forward, rather than just ignoring it or saying that fertility decline is a private problem. So I want to end here by saying that the perspective of reproductive governance encourages us to consider sexual and reproductive rights not as private matters, but as a vital part of the sustainable development conversation that includes things like aging, migration, and climate considerations, as well as politics, the politics of populism, the politics of conservatism, and the politics of pronatalism. I think we need to include those things in the conversation and see where we can go by bringing all of these different discussions together. So I will stop there. I'm a little bit under time, but that's what I've put together to talk about today, and that leaves us more time for a conversation and discussion. So at this point, I will open it to your questions, and I look forward to your thoughts on this matter.
Yes. So, Anne got the question. So am I now visible? Thank you. Lynn Morgan, thank you so much for a brilliant talk. This was just extremely interesting to listen to, and you covered, the whole array of problems related to, how reproductive health and rights are to be tackled in the global, on the global development agenda. So thank you so much. I would like to start off with a question which is very close to my heart and also relating to research that we have been doing concerning reproductive health and rights, in particular in relation to abortion, because of course you were talking about how, the political right and also, the conservative forces are kind of joining to limit women's reproductive rights and also work in concerted ways and across the globe and in similar manners to limit women's reproductive health and rights in and I'm thinking here in particular rights to abortion rights, and there we see different tendencies. We see some in some areas abortion rights are tightened, like for instance in Poland, but then also, and I'm here thinking about opportunities and possibilities. We have seen in Latin America, in particular, a huge feminist mobilization for abortion rights, and we saw it in Argentina, and which got a new abortion law in 2020 December, and also the more broad Ni Una Menos, so mobilization against femicide across the Latin American continent, because I was thinking about the potential of political mobilization and the potential, the hope that could lie therein.
Yes, thank you. There is a lot of reason for hope, and that's an important thing to keep in mind, that a lot of people have argued, even in the development community, that the fight for, the struggle for the inclusion of reproductive and sexual rights, reproductive rights in particular, and particularly the right to abortion, that has successfully been included in a lot of development initiatives, international developmental initiatives since the 1990s. And that is in fact true. And I think that's really important to remember, that in many countries now there is a consensus, and there is a global consensus, that reproductive rights and the right to abortion are very, very important and a vital part of the other kinds of women's health initiatives that have been made available or should be made available. At the same time, a lot of scholars have pointed to an increase in conservative social movements that are trying to thwart these advances. And so I would never want to assume that there's a teleological progression towards a better world that will be more inclusive. Things can also go the other way. And I think it depends very much on the governments that are elected, the representatives that they send to these international forums, the composition of international courts, and so forth. I don't think it's necessarily true that things are that they're just moving in one direction towards a more positive direction. So you are right to point to the importance of social movements. And I think that is really vital around the world. That's one of the things that was responsible in Argentina for the legalization of abortion, was just a massive mobilization of feminists, gay rights activists, women's health activists, and others from across the board, including medical personnel, politicians, and so forth, that all got together to agree that it was time for this to happen in Argentina. So I think that it's really important to make note of social movements and to realize that social movements aren't just necessarily on the left, but they're also on the right. But governments respond to social movements. I mean, we're seeing that in Poland also, that social movements are really vital. And so for those of you who are interested in this, I think that's where the action is happening right now, is within the social movements. And so I would call the sustainable development community to task a little bit for dropping the ball on this, for abdicating some of their responsibility collectively to continue to work on these issues. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me. There's been a lot of hard work that's been done on this, and yet some of the international development community has not really been able to maintain or sustain a commitment to reproductive rights to the extent that we would like. So a recent study showed, for example, that some of the language of gender equity and reproductive rights was actually disappearing from the international consensus documents over time. And that's a concern, and that's something that really needs to be addressed. So I think this is being taken up in social movements. That's where the future lies. But it's also really important that the international development community continue to press on these issues and not cede ground to these conservative forces that are themselves working to develop coalitions that will oppose further progress along these lines.
Thank you very much. I have a question, or maybe it's a statement, but I would like to test it on you in any case. So the question is if you would be advocating for an 18th Sustainable Development Goal for reproductive health and global population. Would that be a good suggestion, you think?
I'm not sure that I'm willing to go on record saying that that's what we need right now. I think there were a number of people that were advocating in the lead up to the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals. There were a number of people that were advocating for greater collaboration and conversation between the reproductive health and rights community and activists on one hand, and those interested in the consequences of population decline on poverty, on environmental degradation, and so forth, that there's been too much siloing of these different constituencies. And so that's one thing that I've often been lamenting, really, has been the lack of collaboration and consideration, because I think that the different constituencies tend to become very fixed on what their own particular goals are and haven't been willing to work with people outside of those realms. So what that has meant is that reproductive rights and reproductive health has been siloed, and that it's not always a part of the other conversations that are going on. And I think that's some of the work that needs to happen. So whether I would advocate an 18th Sustainable Development Goal that was specifically on reproductive rights, or whether I would like to see an attention to gender and reproductive rights suffused throughout all of the other Sustainable Development Goals, I think that would be really the question.
Yeah, so we would go for a mainstreaming model.
A mainstreaming model.
A mainstreaming model.
Yeah.
We have a question concerning the formulation of or the development of the SDGs. So do we have any data? This is from Gemma. Do we have any data on the gender of the parties who created the SDGs?
I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe somebody else would know. I think that it was really a very large, long-term effort over a long period of time, but I don't know the specific answer to that question.
Thank you. We have, I think I would encourage people, I heard that there was somebody raising his hand, but I would encourage those who have questions to write them in the chat, because then they become more manageable for us who are not seeing everyone on the screen. Yes, thank you. So any other, yeah, so I think there is a comment from Maria, who is from Argentina, and she says that the legalization of abortion was thanks to a collective movement with great force. It was interesting that within each political party, there were differences between the representatives. This contributed to the lack of homogeneous thinking within each political party. So I thought that was also an interesting comment. Would you like to add anything there?
Yeah, I think that was a very interesting move. What happened in Argentina when the leaders of the political parties agreed to let their representatives vote as they wished, to vote their conscience. And that is not something that's happened in other places. In other places, the political parties have taken a very firm stance, and they've really encouraged or forced their representatives from those parties to adhere to those stances. That contributes to polarization, to the polarization of the issue. The polarization of the issue, I think we should recognize, in some places has been politically very useful. And so we need to consider what are the political uses of polarization and in contributing to people fighting against each other rather than finding out where the common ground is and working together to resolve some of the issues.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Then there is a question from Mulu. How far has the Biden administration come, or will likely go, to reverse the limiting measures on sexual and reproductive health the previous administration imposed?
The Biden administration has already done quite a bit to reverse some of the policies of the previous administration around reproductive and sexual rights issues, including lifting the global gag rule. Of course, that was something that was very important to the international community. But I think it's also gone on record saying that the US is now fully supporting sexual and reproductive rights initiatives at the international level in the international community. And that will be a big change. The Biden administration also distanced itself from, repudiated actually, the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which was pulled together by Mike Pompeo, who was a former Department of Secretary of State, who got a number of different governments, really ultra-conservative governments and authoritarian governments, to agree to that there was no international right to an abortion. So the Biden administration has now repudiated that declaration. The question, of course, with the United States is whether this policy will then shift if another administration comes into power. So it's been a lot of flip-flopping back and forth depending on which administration is in power in the United States, which has led a lot of countries to just abandon hope in the United States for setting any kind of consistent example for the rest of the world. And I think that's justified based on what I've seen. So there are other countries. The European Union has been much more consistent in its support for sexual and reproductive rights. And a number of places are looking more to the European Union than they are to the US at this point in time.
Okay, so questions are ticking in here. How do we lobby for sexual and reproductive health in countries where religion is very much in play?
Well, religion doesn't necessarily, was there more to that?
No,
religion doesn't necessarily mean that people are opposed to sexual and reproductive health issues. I think that there's a lot of ambiguity there. In fact, one of the things I know from working in Latin America is that Catholics are some of the highest users in terms of percentage of contraceptive services, even though the position of the Vatican has been opposed to contraception. So just because somebody subscribes to a particular religion doesn't mean that they're opposed to sexual or reproductive rights. I think that that's been proven again and again around the world. What we're really seeing is that the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, the leaders of many of these more conservative religious organizations, whether Catholic or Protestant evangelical religions or Muslim leaders or Jewish leaders, have felt like they're going to take a hardline position, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the views of many of the lay members of those religious organizations. So yes, certainly religion needs to be taken into account. It needs to be taken seriously. In fact, I think that's one of the things that the development community often overlooks, is the importance of religion in people's lives. But I think we also need to pay attention to how religion is being manipulated in the current era. That was something that became very obvious in the United States under the previous administration with the policy that removed children from their families at the border. Because family values, family unification and so forth is very much a Christian value, and yet it was being abrogated by government policy. Yet we didn't see the religious leaders necessarily stepping up and opposing that publicly in the way that they might have. So there's a lot of inconsistency within religion. I think that it's sometimes much too simplistic to say that because a country is primarily Catholic, for example, that means that they will necessarily oppose contraception, sterilization, in vitro fertilization, and abortion. They won't. Many Catholic countries have legalized divorce, which the Catholic Church is also opposed to. Some of them have legalized prostitution, which the Catholic Church is also opposed to. And so there isn't necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between religious affiliation and attitudes towards reproductive and sexual rights.
Thank you. Then I have one question concerning abortion, and then another one on environmental justice. Let's take the abortion one first. I can also see that there is a conversation going on here, but let me give it to you as it was phrased. With respect to declining world population, don't you think restrictions on abortion should be intensified, especially where the life of the mother is not threatened?
No, I don't personally believe that. I think that what that does is it forces women to become mothers against their will, and in many cases, that is it's a form of incarceration, of taking over their bodies. It's a form of forcing them into a situation where they must bear and raise children, even in states that don't provide adequate support for parents. And that's something that you find in a lot of situations, is that people say, I would like to have another child, but I can't afford to have another child. And in the absence of really reliable contraceptive services, that it's inevitable that people will become pregnant even when they don't want to, and that they will opt to terminate a pregnancy. So I don't think that abortion should be restricted. I think that it needs to be left up to individual women and their partners and their medical providers to make those decisions for themselves. There are just too many unknowns. It's a very difficult situation to be able to legislate for an entire population, because you hear about too many considerations of people who just can't, for one reason or another, have another child at that moment in time. I mean, I'll just point out, in my own personal history, I'm sure many of you have these kinds of stories, that I had 2 abortions. I had 2 children, and my mother had 4 children. Her mother had 9 children, and her father, my great grandfather, had 19 children. So it's an indication of what kinds of reproductive options we have access to, what we do with those options, and then what we make of our lives as a result of that. So it's these decisions are, we don't make them in isolation, but we should be able to have some control over these decisions ourselves.
Oh, now there are lots of questions and comments ticking in here. I'm now presenting to you a question on environmental justice. It's a bit long, I will read it. We still see many on the right of the environmental movement, or eco-fascists, who shift the focus onto overpopulation amongst developing countries. It was part of the manifesto of the Christchurch shooting killer, is a comment here. Much of the climate justice movement is trying to reframe the discussion of emissions reductions to focus on globally unequal consumption patterns and extractivist capitalist accumulation. How would you imagine your frame could be taken up in the environmental justice movement without undermining their focus?
So I thank you for bringing that up. That's something that I didn't talk very much about, but it's certainly there as one of the considerations. So it's not just authoritarian states that are interested in pronatalism. I think you're right that some of the eco-fascists, as you call them, also have been really hammering on this idea of overpopulation. And that creates sort of strange bedfellows sometimes, but allows them to push ahead on this kind of issue. I think that one of the things that needs to be considered appeared in the slide that I presented about Jade Sasser's work and about other ways of thinking about overpopulation. So in response to someone who says that overpopulation is the biggest problem that needs to be solved in order to fix the environmental problems, you can say, but what about the unequal distribution of resources? What about the inequitable consumption of the world's resources? What about the fact that the rich countries consume so much more than the poor countries of all of the world's resources? And kind of shift it to a conversation about about overproduction, overconsumption, and inequitable consumption rather than overpopulation per se. So I think that's one way to kind of move the conversation a little bit, but yeah, it's a really important question.
Thank you. Then I have a question from Drishi. The culture of son preference in countries like India restrict fertility choices for women and pose threats to reproductive health rights and the public health system. I would be interested to hear your comments around these issues.
Around the issue of son preference, I think that there's been quite a bit of work on this within the anthropological community on looking at the importance of different systems of descent. And I think personally that son preference in some countries emerges from a patrilineal social organization where descent is considered to be passed down from father to son. That's a system that always discriminates against women, because women become, in that kind of a kinship system, the bearers of sons. That is their primary focus, is to bear sons for the patrilineage. I think that as the world population declines, that changes somewhat. We see the importance of the patrilineage declining in some places in the world. And that means that that women's value as social subjects within a patrilineal social organization actually increases. And so as women's value in the society goes up, then you get less of an emphasis on son preference. So there has been some work done in China, in urban populations in China, showing that daughters are actually much more valued than they used to be and are considered in some families actually preferred over having sons. Because, well, for a variety of reasons, but because they will consider themselves able to take care of their parents and their aging elderly family in a way that sons wouldn't necessarily consider important. So it's a complicated issue. I don't want to reduce it too much to that, but I think that it's shifting over time, this preference for sons.
Thank you. There is also a discussion going in the chat concerning the divorce and rights to divorce as a part of this problem. And I think there are very few countries that do not allow people to divorce. But I hear from, let me just scroll up, the Philippines. Yes, where divorce is illegal, but I think the issue of marital relations and of course economic dependency and freedom to choose also in that sense, and also of course in relation to family violence, there are also tensions around these issues, and they are coupled to issues around, the ideas of family values and protection of the privacy of the family. Reproductive and social reproduction in a broader sense. Could you comment on that in relation to the issues we have been discussing now?
Certainly. I'm sorry I'm not able to read the chat while I'm talking.
No, of course not. I'm trying to read the chat for you.
But I would say that I think the kinds of questions that it sounds like people are asking in the chat, the kinds of conversations that people are asking in the chat is exactly the kinds of conversations that need to be considered. They're really broad ranging conversations that have to do with a number of different issues about how domestic life is organized, how families are organized, how the states respond to that, what kinds of constraints they put in place, and what kinds of social welfare programs they put in place to try and accommodate this. And this does have implications for things like domestic violence, for women's ability to sustain themselves without a husband, for example. In some places that's not economically possible. In some places that's become economically necessary as men are increasingly migrating to find work in other locations. So how does the government respond to that then? Do they respond with a basic income? Do they respond by cutting people off from welfare benefits and making them go to work? What impact does that have on childcare? All of these things are connected. And that's one of the reasons that me and some of my colleagues, my colleague Laura Briggs, have talked about how reproduction is really at the center of all politics. even though we often isolate reproduction as a topic, it's really central to a lot of the things that governments are talking about and dealing with. It's central to a lot of political life. And so when you start thinking in the way that it sounds like you're thinking in the chat here, those of you collectively thinking about this in the chat, these are the kinds of things that need to be connected as we think about social policy solutions moving forward. We can't leave any of this out. So of course it's huge. It's too huge to talk about in an hour, but they're the right kinds of questions. They're the things that need to be considered as we're thinking about putting it together. And it's done not just from the perspective of anthropology. I think this is, of course, feminist economists have been talking about this, and a lot of people in development studies are talking about this. We need to have the demographers in conversation with the reproductive rights people to talk about, well, what are the challenges that are posed by population decline over time? And how can we approach those kinds of challenges while remaining strongly committed to reproductive and sexual rights goals that have been articulated in so many international agreements? So you're asking the right questions.
Yeah, and there are so many interesting questions, and we only have 4 minutes left. I'll try to at least cover. Let me see if there are some of them are similar. There was one question relating to Spain. In Spain, maternal age has been increasing, and maternal age has been increasing. Fertility rate has been decreasing. One of the reasons is that there is a higher rate of unemployment and precarity among youth. More often than not, women cannot afford to have a baby until they are in their 30s or 40s. Is the government failing to guarantee reproductive rights?
Certainly, the economy is absolutely critical to people's decisions about whether and when to have children. And so in that sense, you could argue, yes, that the government is failing if it's failing to make economic opportunity accessible and available to people, if it's failing to make educational opportunities available to people, especially women, if it's failing to make social services available to people. So that's one of our big challenges now, is how to help governments create policies that will be responsive to population decline over time, that will not be harmful to the environment, or in fact help to reverse some of the climate change that we're seeing at such a rapid pace, and also be respectful of reproductive rights. And so it would be a tricky situation in Spain. You'd want to explore how much of this is women's desire to have fewer children, or to marry later, or have children later, if at all. And how much of it is them feeling like they have their hands tied and they really are not able to make these kinds of decisions because they just can't afford it. So those are the kinds of considerations that need to be brought together, always with the gender awareness, with attention to a gendered perspective on these things, and an awareness to our commitments to reproductive and sexual rights. How can we move forward on some of these big questions without rolling that back and without blaming women for some of the problems of the world?
Thank you. And now we have time, I think, for one more question, and I can't decide which one to choose. Oh, I think since Mulu has already gotten a response to one question, I will give the opportunity to Marte Sandvik. Roland, could you please comment on relationship between population decline and immigration within the framework of reproductive governance? In Norway, the Prime Minister is urging us to have more children to sustain the aging population, while putting in place more restrictive immigration policies. And this is, this is not a particular Norwegian issue. I think you have the same across Europe in many countries. Yeah. The hardening borders.
Right. Mm-hmm. So it gets back to the question about Spain, really, and about work. People are migrating because they don't have options, economic options, work options. They're migrating because they're climate refugees, and the droughts are making it impossible for them to grow crops, or their lands are getting flooded. All of these kinds of things are pushing people to migrate and to different places. And that is, in some places, that's seen as a solution to some of the population decline problems and scarcity of labor. But other countries are becoming very nationalistic about their approaches to migration and saying, we don't want those people to come to our country. We want our own people, quote unquote, to reproduce. And so you can see that as a form of stratified reproduction that is racist and that really needs to be countered. I mean, in my own country, we think about all of us except Native American populations are migrants initially to this country. And the waves of government response to migration, to widespread migration, have followed very closely the economic well-being of the country. In other words, migration they tend to clamp down on migration when the economies are declining. And then when there's lots of work, then they open the doors to migration. So it's a duplicitous policy. It's not consistent over time. Again, all of these things are related.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that was a very good way to end. All of the things, everything is related to everything. So thank you so much, Lynn. And I think we will end our session here. Thanks to everyone who participated. It was really inspirational. Also the conversation and the really excellent questions that you all posed in the chat. And I hope I didn't overlook too many of them. But in any case, have a good afternoon and enjoy your course further on.
Thank you to all of you. And good luck.
You.
We're counting on you to solve all of these problems.
Of course, but not us. All the young
That's
people.
Right.